Jeremy, I want to thank you for the invitation this morning, and thank all of you for your interest in Westar's role in our community's economic outlook. In our business, we enjoy a special vantage point. We have the privilege of working with all sectors of the economy. And for some, we know there's tremendous excitement. Things like the opportunity to poke holes in new formations using a technology that we know can transform an industry and even an entire state's economy. For others, we know you're still waiting on orders, and that uncertainty causes you to wonder, is now the time to invest more or not? So whether you're excited or you're uncertain, Westar's role in our economic outlook remains the same. It's for us to assure that our electricity is available, reliable, and affordable, in that order. And that's really the Cliff Notes version of my remarks this morning. Our role in the economic outlook of our community is to assure that electricity is available, reliable, and affordable. We believe we're on the right track because that's what you tell us. For those of you developing new projects, you need to know we won't keep you waiting. For those of you putting more sophisticated controls on your equipment, our electricity needs to be increasingly reliable. And for all of us worried about the general economy, you need to know we're paying attention to costs and prices. There are a few different ways to make electricity, and at Westar we use virtually all of them. I'd like to share with you some of the pros and cons of each of those and why they lead us to generate your electricity the way we do. Because electricity is a foundation of the economy, we can't do much without it. I'll share a few facts and opinions about it and some of what we're doing to make sure our state's electric needs are met. And I'll start with just a few facts about Westar. We're one of only a half a dozen or so NYSE-traded companies still headquartered in Kansas. Our shareholders are people like you and me, individuals, and 20,000 of our Kansas friends and neighbors, along with institutions, mostly traditional mutual funds. We're a Kansas company. All of our customers are in the state. Our 2,400 employees work and live here. And we've invested about $9 billion here in the state, most of which are impossible to move. Though in Kansas some might think of us as big business, we're actually kind of on the small side for our industry, in an industry that's kind of smallish by itself. If you're to add up the stock market value of all of the electric utilities in the country, it'd still be dwarfed by Apple. Our goal, as I said, is to do one thing, and it's to provide reliable energy, affordable energy, 24/7, with customers reminding us that affordability is as much about avoiding volatility as it is price level generally. And this guides how we produce your electricity. It also leads us to a couple of philosophical underpinnings. We think it's unrealistic to try to predict the future of energy, other than to expect continued wild swings, big policy shifts, and volatile commodity markets. For us, that means not swinging for the fences, sticking to our knitting, and just making sure your lights stay on. So with that foundation, let's talk energy. More specifically, let's talk electricity. Energy drives our economy. Over time, we've made energy more orderly, and thus it's more valuable as our human existence has become more complex. So consider, for example, the value and usefulness of an open flame 150 years ago to generate heat and light. And compare that to the highly ordered electricity that powers things like laser eye surgery or carbon fiber technology. Electricity is just fundamental to our safe, convenient, and productive way of life. But it's a challenge for our industry when the things that electricity enables are perceived to be so much more valuable than the underlying electricity. Many of our customers pay far more for their mobile phone service or their television or their internet service than they do for electricity. And I suspect value them more too. For most, electricity simply comes from the socket, and that's all they want to know. But consider how each of us uses electricity. Just this morning, let's hit the highlights. You woke to an alarm clock, you flipped on some lights, you showered. Some of us were lucky enough to use a hairdryer. You made a cup of coffee, you pulled something cold out of the fridge, maybe popped a bagel in the toaster. You unplugged your cell phone charger. There's a decent chance you checked your email, scanned a couple of websites, Set the security system, open and close the garage door. Then the traffic lights got you here safely, and this microphone allows you to hear my voice. Now, I'd suspect that there are not many of you that had given a single thought to any of that until just a second ago. Or that on average, most households pay less for their daily Westar electricity than the cost of a gallon of gas or a cup of Starbucks. This is a nighttime satellite photo over the Korean Peninsula. Light versus darkness indeed. It's not just a border and ideology that separates these two peoples. Virtually all South Koreans have access to affordable, reliable electricity, just like here. But very few in the North have the virtues of the plug. We're told that South Korean school children are six times more likely to survive the perils of infancy. And when they go to school, they have a height, weight, and health advantage on their northern cousins. And the correlation is much broader. It spans the globe. This picture illustrates how a UN composite of life expectancy, standard of living, and literacy combined on the vertical scale, where higher is better, correlates with electricity consumption per capita on the horizontal scale. It's way better to be in the upper right-hand corner in the US or Canada than in electricity-deprived Pakistan or Ethiopia. Where electricity is abundant and accessible and, frankly, consumed in greater quantities, people live better lives. Where it's scarce, life is harsh and short. A corollary is that policies that make electricity more expensive and less accessible than it needs to be, they put human well-being, including basic human health and economic strength, at risk. Sometimes policymakers don't always think about these second-order effects and how they affect the lives of others. People love to pick on the US and our big energy appetite. But it's too easy to stumble if we're just staring at our left foot. This is the carbon footprint of nations, with the circles indicating the relative contribution of countries in the world. You can see the big bunions here appear to be the United States and Canada. Or I'm sorry, and China, beg your pardon. But rather than looking just at what we emit and what we use, let's also consider what we do with it. Though our carbon emissions are about the same, our GDP per capita is still multiples of China's. On a per capita basis, our footprint is much more modest and right in line with other developed first world nations. We use a lot of energy here, but we do a lot with it. Because electricity is so germane to our existence, that's probably why policymakers at the federal level are so prone to tinkering with it. Even though their record of accomplishment is, well, let's be charitable and say spotty. Among the reasons to shatter our nation's best laid energy plans are shifting environmental and safety concerns, technological change, commodity cycles, and the maddeningly complex interactions among them. Our brains seem to hate uncertainty and complexity so much that we just can't resist imposing false assumptions, trying to manufacture certainty where it can't exist. History illustrates my point. Each method of making electricity has its sharp advantages and disadvantages, with the degree of sharpness catching us by surprise quite often. Conceding to the uncertainty of all this, Westar intentionally uses virtually all forms of it to round out our energy portfolio, all with the goal of keeping it available, reliable, and affordable. Let's start with a look at the level and where electricity comes from for the nation as a whole. We can quickly disregard oil. We don't use any appreciable amount of petroleum to generate electricity in this country and at Westar. Natural gas is way more interesting, particularly since we don't know much about it, like how much of it exists, where we're going to get it, or what it should cost. Our nation was so sure in the 1970s that we were running out of it that by act of Congress, no less, electric utilities were prohibited from using any more of it to make electricity, only to find, and this before the ink was dry on the act, that we had an abundance of it. It's had a volatile price history. This is just the last decade. 4 years ago, it was $12 a unit. This spring, as low as $2 a unit, and since April, it's up about 50%. Electric utilities are now encouraged to embrace gas and abandon nearly all else to its favor. Who needs coal and nuclear with all this cheap, abundant natural gas? As a result, gas has gone from fueling about 20% of our nation's electricity to almost 25%, with official predictions taking it over 40%. All at the same time, there's a growing movement seeking to impair or outlaw the very technology that allows us to have that abundant cheap gas. Imagine what it would mean for electricity prices if gas were to rise from $3 today back to $12 or even more in a few years. Now, before you say that can't happen, think about all the things in the past that did happen that we didn't see coming. Another thing about natural gas, it typically has a deceivingly low spot price compared to the price of a long-term contract, if you can find someone willing to lock up long-term contracts at a fixed price. It's also interesting to see how natural gas trades and to consider whether that would change. And Jim pointed this out. Today, dry gas associated with the production of electricity is a low-valued byproduct. If oil prices were to decline, there's going to be low associated gas on the market. Oil trades within a few dollars a barrel virtually anywhere in the world. This is the price of oil last week in Houston, London, and Tokyo. Here are the same locational prices for natural gas. It's hard to imagine how in a global economy we'll tolerate $14 gas in Tokyo in a country shutting down its nuclear plants and replacing it with natural gas. Well, it remains just a fifth of that on our Gulf Coast. Right now, we have companies busily converting unfinished LNG import facilities, converting them to export facilities, all because of this price discrepancy. And some don't even like the idea of exporting natural gas. Nuclear. We've seen nuclear go from too cheap to meter to any more of it would be absolutely unthinkable, eventually on to being perhaps our best low-carbon alternative, with an advocate of the industry now being one of the co-founders of Greenpeace, if you can imagine that. And now with Fukushima and low natural gas prices, opinions are shifting again. It takes a decade at least to plan and construct a nuclear plant. It involves unimaginably expensive equipment that you can only do if you can confidently know that you'll collect the investment over the next half century. Renewables, let's move on to renewables. Everybody likes to talk about those. This would suggest excuse me, that renewables make up a decent slice of our electricity in this country, about 10%. But that would include hydro, and it's not politically correct in most circles to include hydro as renewable. So let's just narrow it to wind, solar, biomass, and geothermal. Even though geothermal really isn't renewable, but people like it, so they pretend that it is. In Kansas, renewable really means wind. Right now, there's nothing that comes close on price yet. And as much as we like wind energy at Westar Energy, and our increasing commitment to it shows that we do, it too has its disadvantages. Namely, the annoying habit of it only producing electricity when the wind blows, and when it's not too hot outside. We've committed a lot to wind energy. In fact, more than what the law says we need to in Kansas, and we've negotiated great prices for it. And yet, if our customers were to depend predominantly on wind energy, both the cost and value of their electricity would be compromised. Merrill Teller tells us that we had 36 days over 100 degrees last summer. Here are the average temperatures for each hour on those very hot days, starting at midnight and ending at midnight the next day. It looks a lot like our electricity demand. You got to watch this closely. As peak temperatures and air conditioning demand both occur about 4 to 6 p.m. This is the output from our wind generators at those same hours on those very same hot days. Now, I didn't flip the chart upside down. Low wind production occurs when our customers most need electricity. Now don't get me wrong. Wind is a wonderful emission-free fuel substitute when the wind is blowing, and it's a hedge against fuel costs. And it's an important and growing part of a diversified portfolio, and it is fabulous for our rural economies in Kansas. But it is no substitute for a power plant that we can dispatch according to our customers' changing energy needs. Each time you flip a switch, you trigger a chain of events that ultimately has a computer, even if so small, incrementally adjusting the output of a power plant to meet that need, your need. On a practical scale, technology doesn't yet exist to store energy. We have to produce it as you consume it. Think of it as the ultimate just-in-time inventory with time measured in an instant. And we're really good at that with traditional plants. But we haven't found anyone yet that can make the wind blow on demand, even in an election year. We can call on our nuclear plants and our fossil plants 24/7, whether the wind is blowing or the sun is shining. On to coal. When our largest and newest, now 30-year-old, coal plant was commissioned in the 1970s, Vice President Walter Mondale was on hand to cut the ribbon and extol its environmental virtues. Today, after having invested $750 million in state-of-the-art emission controls, some want to call it dirty. By the way, here's the same plant on a cold day in the winter. Some opponents of our industry, they love to snap pictures on these humid winter days, because if you snap it from a backlit perspective, all that puffy white steam looks dark and sooty. So don't be fooled by how the temperature and the humidity make the water vapor more or less visible. That water vapor, mixed with crushed Kansas limestone, is exactly what removes almost 100% of the sulfur dioxide, changing it into gypsum. Well, with cheap gas and almost overwhelming opposition to our most abundant domestic fuel, a lot of folks say, why even bother with coal plants anymore? Why retrofit them for these environmental regulations? Well, there are a couple of answers to that. The first is that coal is not coal. It varies significantly by chemical composition, thermal characteristics, location, and price. Here's the cost per megawatt hour of the same number of BTUs of natural gas, Appalachian coal, and the coal we use from Wyoming. You can see there's quite a difference. And even when you add transportation costs, we understand why many utilities elsewhere have trimmed back on natural gas or trimmed up back on coal rather and ramped up natural gas. It makes sense. But one should be careful about making general statements about that. Even after taking into consideration the cost of retrofitting our plants, our coal plants still remain the least expensive baseload electric resource for our customers. And remember when I said our customers tell us their perceptions of affordability have as much to do with volatility as with price level? Well, coal has consistently been much more consistent in its price and is one of the reasons for the relative stability of our fuel costs. And our fuel costs make up a significant portion of your bill. Another reason coal still makes sense is security of fuel supply. Now, interruptions in fuel supply, they can and do occur. Thankfully, they're infrequent, but they're significant. For natural gas and coal, they both occur, but they're very different. We have the capability of storing a month or two of coal at the plant site in inventory. There's really no meaningful quantity of natural gas that we can effectively store at the plant site. Also, for decades, our coal plants in Kansas have provided nearly 800 great jobs, a $75 million annual payroll, and a $25 million annual contribution to property taxes. Though we haven't built a new coal plant in 3 decades, relying instead on wind and natural gas to meet the incremental demand, our coal stations continue to provide tremendous value. Before taking on the retrofit obligations, we carefully analyzed the options and costs and concluded that it made sense to invest in keeping them reliable and clean for decades. How clean? The results are remarkable. Here are our principal emissions, with sulfur dioxide down over 80% and nitrogen oxide down almost 60% in just the last few years. And we're in good company. Across the nation, all principal power plant emissions are down markedly over the past 20 years, even as we've boosted production by 40%. Now, there's a lot of discussion these days about power plant emissions and diagnoses of asthma and other respiratory diseases, and these are important topics, and they deserve our very best science and well-directed policy. It's too serious a matter to take easy paths to convenient conclusions. If emissions are in marked decline, maybe these problems aren't quite so obvious, and we need to consider the consequences of behaving as though they are. Balance here is vital. Of course we want our electricity to be cleaner, and we're making it so, but we can also make it so clean that few can afford it, and impact our economy and our way of life in the process. Whom do you think here enjoys better air quality and basic human health? I would argue that the most important aspect of human health associated with electricity would be having to do without it. We wish we knew of a way to make reliable, affordable power with no unwanted effects, but life doesn't work that way. When we build roads and airports and factories and schools and cities, when we clean our water and when we produce our food, we impact our environment. Just think for a moment how our food production affects a native landscape. Balance in what we do is vital, not only to manage environmental impact, but to assure that we keep electricity reliable and affordable so that people can enjoy the health, productivity, comfort, and convenient benefits that it allows. We've made our power plants a lot cleaner, but we need to be careful not to make them so clean people can't afford to use the product. Let me illustrate. Let's say this is NOx emissions from one of our coal plants. For a typical large coal plant, we can tweak, it takes a lot of work, but we can tweak boiler temperatures and combustion chemistry to remove about 3/4 of the nitrogen oxide emissions. At our largest coal plants, this costs about $40 million. Now, $40 million is still a lot of money, at least to us, but frankly, at this scale and for what you get, it's a bargain. But when someone says a 75% reduction isn't enough, you need a 90% reduction, the price of that little increment gets exponentially expensive. It requires an entirely different technology that costs $250 million per unit. That might be just the increment that pushes electricity out of reach for some or pushes some business over the edge. At Westar, we've tried to be honest and open about what all these regulations mean for our customers and the economy, and we push back. Our nation's air regulators have been incredibly effective, and with their relentless prodding and our dutiful compliance, the air we breathe today is cleaner than any of us have ever breathed in our lifetimes. Regulators should be proud of that accomplishment, as we are in these results. But let's be careful not to extrapolate similar gains from the now much lower levels. Every farmer knows you don't get a yield payoff simply by throwing more fertilizer in the seeder. Rules and regulations need to be based on both sound science and sound economics. That's why we believe strongly in the merits of government and business collaborating and cooperating and working together for good solutions. And I'm happy to say that is our experience in Kansas. My critique this morning of each way of making electricity, I know sounds sharp, but we recognize that there are no silver bullets here. Each method, as I said, has advantages and disadvantages, and we use them all. Planning for our state's electric needs requires flexibility, adaptability, and a lot of cooperation. I have no idea whether cheap natural gas is here for the long term or not. I do know that it surprised a lot of smart people when it went from $12 to $2. And I suspect equally smart people would be surprised by something, whatever it might be, that could cause the reverse of that, or even more. One of our responsibilities in our economy is to force long-term memory, even when it's uncomfortable, politically incorrect, or even appears naive to do so. We'll do all that and more if it keeps our customers and our states from falling victim to short-term overconfidence and herd mentality. With that backdrop, here's how we make your electricity. Our equipment set, in which we've invested, gives us this capability. But we optimize the production of electricity based on cost and reliability, so it looks more like this. This is how we produce the energy you use, with the lion's share coming from coal and nuclear, and smaller but growing slices of natural gas and wind. This energy mix is the principal driver of the cost of your electricity and its relative price stability. And while commodity prices, equipment demands, and EPA regs have resulted in an increasing trend, we still maintain a relative price advantage to other utilities in Kansas and across the nation as a whole. For households, more meaningful might be the percentage of income that it requires to pay for electricity. Westar electricity costs about the same as it did 20 years on that basis, with about a decade of declining costs in between. So more recently, it's come up to this 2.4% level. The increasing trend recently comes largely from environmental mandates, transmission improvements, and renewable energy mandates. We're about 2/3 of the way through this big environmental retrofit program, so hopefully we're on the downside of that. Almost all of our coal plants are now scrubbed with state-of-the-art equipment to remove sulfur dioxide and to meet most of what's required under the known existing regulations. This is an outlook conference, so if you'll grant me the caveat of an uncertain energy future and policy and commodity markets, we expect that the rate of future price increases for your electricity will go up more modestly than it has in the past, the recent past, but you shouldn't expect them to remain flat. There will be continuing demands for mandated environmental, transmission, renewable, and now federally mandated reliability and homeland security improvements on our system and our infrastructure. Though our costs, other than fuel, of course, are largely fixed, regulations require that we charge you based on how much of it you use. So if you think through this with me, it hasn't helped prices when electricity sales have been flat to declining with the economy. And many things contribute to electricity sales being flat. It's a combination of efficiency and technology and price response and the still soft economic conditions. Household formation in the state is down, and Westar customers are down as well. In fact, they're running at just a fraction of what they were a few years ago. And notwithstanding those 36 days over 100 degrees in Wichita, peak electricity demand last summer was 3% lower than last year. To put that in perspective, that difference is about the equivalent of the electricity demand for the entire Kansas aerospace industry and our state's major universities combined. We have the privilege of working closely with many of you and your planners and managers, and what we hear from most of our business customers is cautious optimism, and with a focus on optimism. But most of it seems to be at the micro level as they look at their business. They feel good about their businesses for the most part, but they seem to be reluctant to expand and invest based on the prevailing macro sentiment. That's what seems to be keeping them from expanding. While not the near-perfect correlation of days gone past, the kilowatt-hour per GDP ratio, in other words, the electricity sales and how they tie to GDP, are still highly correlated. Domestic production drives electricity. So our fate is tied to the Kansas economy. As I said earlier, our assets don't transport. So we have a keen interest in the economic well-being of Wichita and Kansas. We believe the best thing that we can do to promote economic growth is to keep our electric service available when you need it, increasingly reliable, and affordable. Again, thank you. It's been my pleasure to address you this morning. Our fate is tied to your fate. Our success is tied to your success. We're in this together.